The date is February 15th, 2026, and the global trade landscape has just witnessed one of the most spectacular reversals of economic leverage in modern North American history. What began as threats of sweeping tariffs and aggressive trade posturing from Washington has culminated in an outcome few predicted. Canada, often perceived as the junior partner in continental commerce, has executed a strategic maneuver so precise, so devastating in its implications, that it has fundamentally altered the balance of power in North American trade negotiations. The weapon? A $5.7 billion bridge. The target? The very foundation of American manufacturing supremacy in the Great Lakes region. To understand the magnitude of what has just transpired, we need to rewind the clock and examine the chessboard as it was set just months ago. Donald Trump, inaugurated for his second term in January 2025, wasted no time in returning to his signature policy playbook. Tariffs, he declared, would be the cornerstone of his economic strategy. Mexico, China, and yes, Canada were all put on notice. The president spoke of unfair trade practices, of borders that leaked illegal goods and people, of trade deficits that hemorrhaged American wealth. Canada, he suggested, had been taking advantage of American generosity for far too long. The rhetoric was familiar to anyone who had followed Trump's first term, but this time the stakes felt different. The global economy had shifted. Supply chains, still fragile from pandemic disruptions, had been reorganized but remained vulnerable. Energy markets were volatile. And perhaps most critically, the political landscape in Canada had changed. Prime Minister Justin Trudeau, who had navigated the turbulent waters of Trump's first presidency, was no longer in power. In his place stood a government that had watched, learned, and prepared for exactly this moment. The initial salvos came in the form of threats. 25% tariffs on Canadian goods unless Canada addressed what Trump called catastrophic border security failures. The American president painted a picture of drugs flowing south to north, of illegal immigrants using Canada as a backdoor into the United States, of a trading partner that had grown complacent and careless. The demands were clear: tighten the border, increase security spending, or face economic consequences that would make the renegotiation of NAFTA look like a friendly disagreement. Canadian officials responded with a mixture of diplomatic patience and barely concealed frustration. They pointed to the facts. The Canadian border was not the Mexican border. The flow of illegal substances and people was a fraction of what crossed the southern U.S. boundary. Canada had already committed billions to border security enhancements, but Trump, true to form, was not interested in nuance. He wanted action, he wanted concessions, and he wanted them publicly. What happened next is where our story truly begins. Because while the world's attention was focused on the theater of press conferences and presidential tweets, a different kind of drama was unfolding in the conference rooms and planning offices of Windsor, Ontario. There, officials were examining blueprints, traffic projections, and economic impact studies for a project that had been in discussion for years but had always seemed like a distant possibility: the Gordie Howe International Bridge. Now, bridges are not typically the stuff of geopolitical intrigue. They are infrastructure, mundane and necessary, the kind of projects that generate ribbon-cutting ceremonies and forgotten press releases. But the Gordie Howe Bridge is not a typical bridge. Stretching across the Detroit River, connecting Windsor, Ontario with Detroit, Michigan, this engineering marvel represents something far more significant than a mere crossing point. It represents the jugular vein of North American automotive manufacturing. Let me paint you a picture of what flows across the Detroit River every single day. Approximately 30% of all trade between Canada and the United States crosses this narrow waterway. We are talking about 8,000 trucks daily, components for Ford, General Motors, and Stellantis, raw materials for factories that employ hundreds of thousands of American workers. The just-in-time manufacturing system that makes modern automotive production possible depends absolutely on the seamless flow of goods across this border. Any disruption, any delay, any uncertainty in this crossing translates directly into billions of dollars in economic impact. For decades, this critical artery has been served primarily by the Ambassador Bridge, a privately owned structure that has been both a blessing and a curse for the region. Built in 1929, the Ambassador Bridge is an aging monument to early 20th century engineering. It is owned by the Moran family, billionaires who have controlled this choke point of international commerce for generations. And while the bridge has served its purpose, it has also been a source of endless frustration. Traffic bottlenecks are common, the bridge's capacity is limited, and perhaps most importantly from a strategic standpoint, the fact that such a critical piece of infrastructure is in private hands has always been a vulnerability. Enter the Gordie Howe Bridge. This project, years in development, represents a complete reimagining of cross-border infrastructure. 6 lanes of traffic, pedestrian and bicycle paths. State-of-the-art customs facilities designed to process vehicles with unprecedented efficiency. When completed, it will be the longest cable-stayed bridge in North America, a gleaming symbol of 21st century engineering rising above the Detroit River. But more than that, it will be something the Ambassador Bridge never was, publicly owned and controlled. And here is where the plot thickens. Because while the Gordie Howe Bridge is an international project, a joint venture between Canada and the United States, the financial structure is anything but equal. Canada has committed to paying the entire construction cost, $5.7 billion. The United States contribution, land on the American side, and the promise of customs facilities. In essence, Canada is building a bridge that will serve both nations, but Canada alone is writing the check. For years, this arrangement was seen as somewhat puzzling. Why would Canada agree to such terms? The explanations varied. Canadian officials spoke of the economic benefits to Windsor and southwestern Ontario. They talked about job creation and improved trade flow. They mentioned the need to reduce dependence on the privately owned Ambassador Bridge. All of these reasons were valid, but they seemed almost too generous, too willing to bear a burden that logically should have been shared. But what if the generosity was strategic? What if Canadian planners, looking at the volatile nature of American politics, at the rise of economic nationalism, at the increasing weaponization of trade policy, saw an opportunity? What if they understood that controlling critical infrastructure was not just about facilitating commerce, but about holding leverage? As Trump's tariff threats escalated in early 2026, Canadian officials began to make quiet calculations. They looked at the nearly completed Gordie Howe Bridge, scheduled to open within months. They examined the traffic patterns, the economic dependencies, the supply chain vulnerabilities. And they asked themselves a simple question. What happens if we control the bridge and we decide to make access contingent on American behavior? The answer was transformative because unlike the Ambassador Bridge, which is privately owned and operates under commercial imperatives, the Gordie Howe Bridge would be a public asset. It could be operated according to policy objectives, not just profit motives. Toll structures could be adjusted. Priority access could be granted or denied. Customs procedures could be streamlined for cooperative partners or made deliberately cumbersome for those deemed problematic. In short, Canada would hold a card it had never held before, the ability to directly impact the operational efficiency of American manufacturing. The realization in Washington came slowly, then all at once. Economic advisors began running models. What would happen if Canada imposed preferential tolls that made the Ambassador Bridge more attractive? What if customs processing on the Canadian side of the Gordie Howe became mysteriously slow? What if maintenance schedules were arranged in ways that created periodic closures during peak shipping times? The answers were sobering. American automotive manufacturers, already operating on razor-thin margins, could see costs spike by hundreds of millions annually. Assembly lines could face shutdowns. The competitive advantage that American manufacturers enjoyed could evaporate. And here is the beautiful irony that Canadian strategists must have savored. Trump's own tariff threats had created the political cover for exactly this kind of counter-strategy. If the American president was willing to weaponize trade policy, to use tariffs as a blunt instrument of coercion, then surely Canada was entitled to use the tools at its disposal. And what better tool than a bridge that America needed but Canada controlled? The chess match entered its decisive phase in late January 2026. Trump, facing pressure from the automotive industry, from Republican governors in Michigan and Ohio, from business groups that understood the precarious nature of cross-border supply chains, found himself in an uncomfortable position. He could proceed with his tariff threats, but doing so would likely trigger Canadian retaliation at the bridge. He could back down, but that would represent a humiliating retreat from his tough-on-trade stance. Behind closed doors, negotiations took on a new character. Canadian officials, once supplicants seeking to avoid tariff pain, now sat at the table with a confidence that bordered on serenity. They had charts and graphs showing the economic impact of various bridge operation scenarios. They had legal opinions confirming their right to set toll structures and operational policies. They had, in short, transformed from the weaker party seeking concessions into power brokers who held a veto over American manufacturing efficiency. The American negotiating team tried various approaches. They appealed to the history of cooperation between the two nations. They pointed out that disrupting trade would hurt Canada too. They suggested that such hardball tactics were beneath the dignity of allies. But Canadian negotiators, steeled by months of tariff threats and presidential insults, were unmoved. They had a simple message. If America wanted to play the game of economic coercion, Canada was ready to play. And in this particular arena, Canada held the better hand. What made the Canadian strategy particularly devastating was its precision. This was not a broad, unfocused retaliation. This was not slapping tariffs on American goods and hoping for the best. This was a scalpel inserted directly into the most vulnerable point of American industrial production. The automotive sector employs directly and indirectly millions of Americans. It is concentrated in swing states that matter enormously in American electoral politics. Michigan, Ohio, Pennsylvania, these are states where plant closures and supply chain disruptions translate directly into political consequences. Trump's political advisors ran the numbers and realized the nightmare scenario. If automotive plants started experiencing shutdowns due to parts shortages caused by border delays at the Gordie Howe Bridge, the political fallout would be immediate and severe. Union workers would blame the administration. Local news would cover the story relentlessly. The economic pain would be concentrated in exactly the communities that had delivered Trump his victory. The midterm elections looming in 2026 would become a referendum on whether the president's trade policies were helping or hurting American workers. Meanwhile, the Canadian government began a sophisticated public relations campaign. They did not threaten. They simply informed. Press releases detailed the operational capabilities of the Gordie Howe Bridge. Economic studies were published showing the bridge's capacity to handle various traffic volumes under different operational scenarios. Canadian officials gave interviews praising the bridge as a model of modern infrastructure, while carefully noting that operational policies would, of course, reflect Canadian national interests and reciprocal treatment in trade relationships. The message was clear without being explicit: play nice or pay the price. And the price would be measured in shuttered assembly lines and unemployed auto workers. By early February 2026, the Trump administration's position had become untenable. The president could continue his tough talk, but the economic and political realities were inescapable. Canada had built a trap, and Trump had walked directly into it. The automotive industry was making frantic calls to the White House. Republican senators from affected states were expressing concern in increasingly public ways. The markets were beginning to price in the possibility of major supply chain disruptions. The climb down, when it came, was carefully choreographed to minimize Trump's embarrassment, but it was a climb down nonetheless. In a joint announcement from Washington and Ottawa, the two governments declared a breakthrough in trade negotiations. The language was diplomatic, speaking of mutual respect and shared prosperity. Tariff threats were quietly shelved. Border security measures were agreed upon that satisfied American concerns without requiring massive new Canadian expenditures. And most tellingly, American officials praised the Gordie Howe Bridge as a testament to binational cooperation and expressed eagerness for its opening. What the announcement did not say, but what everyone in the room understood, was that Canada had just taught the Trump administration a lesson in leverage. The bridge, that $5.7 billion investment that had seemed like Canadian generosity, was revealed for what it truly was: a strategic asset of immense value. By controlling critical infrastructure, Canada had effectively neutralized America's ability to use tariff threats as a cudgel. The implications ripple far beyond this immediate confrontation. Other countries are watching and learning. The era of American economic dominance, of the ability to dictate terms through sheer market size, is facing new challenges. When smaller economies can identify and control choke points in global supply chains, when they can deploy strategic infrastructure investments as geopolitical tools, the traditional hierarchies of power begin to shift. For Canada, this represents a coming of age in strategic thinking. For too long, Canadian foreign and economic policy has been characterized by a certain deference to American power. The assumption has been that Canada, as the smaller economy, must ultimately accommodate American demands. But the Gordie Howe Bridge strategy demonstrates that size is not everything. Precision matters. Strategic positioning matters. Control of critical infrastructure matters. The automotive industry executives who watch this drama unfold are now reassessing their own vulnerabilities. If a bridge can become a geopolitical weapon, what about ports? What about rail connections? What about the countless other infrastructure points where international commerce depends on cooperation? The era of taking infrastructure for granted, of viewing it as mere background to the real business of trade, is ending. Infrastructure is strategy. Infrastructure is power. Environmental implications also loom large in this story. The Gordie Howe Bridge was designed with sustainability in mind, but its strategic value may accelerate broader discussions about green infrastructure as a tool of economic statecraft. Countries that can build the ports, bridges, and rail lines needed for a low-carbon economy will hold tremendous leverage over those that cannot. The lessons of Windsor may apply to solar panel supply chains, to rare earth processing facilities, to battery production networks. For American policymakers, the Gordie Howe episode should prompt serious reflection. The instinct to use tariffs as a first resort in trade disputes has been shown to be potentially counterproductive when adversaries, or in this case allies, have strategic tools of their own. The Trump administration learned that threatening Canada is easy, but backing up those threats when Canada holds critical infrastructure is another matter entirely. There is also a broader lesson about the nature of alliances and partnerships. The relationship between Canada and the United States has always been characterized by deep integration and mutual dependency. But dependency runs both ways. American goods need Canadian routes to market. American factories need Canadian components. The supply chains that make modern manufacturing possible cross the border thousands of times before a finished product emerges. Weaponizing trade in such an environment is a dangerous game because the other side will eventually figure out how to weaponize back. As news of the Canadian victory spread, reactions varied widely. In Windsor and Detroit, there was relief among workers and business owners who had feared the economic chaos that tariff wars and bridge disputes would bring. In Ottawa, there was quiet satisfaction among the officials who had engineered this strategic coup. In Washington, there was frustration and a dawning realization that the world had changed. Political analysts are now reassessing the landscape of North American relations. The assumption that Canada would always yield to American pressure has been shattered. Future negotiations will be approached with a new wariness on the American side and a new confidence on the Canadian side. The psychological shift is perhaps as important as the immediate tactical victory. The private owners of the Ambassador Bridge, meanwhile, face an uncertain future. Their monopoly on Detroit River crossings is about to end. The Gordie Howe Bridge will offer a modern, efficient alternative. But more than that, the strategic importance that Canada has demonstrated in controlling the new bridge may prompt questions about whether critical infrastructure should ever be in private hands. There may be calls for greater public control, for treating bridges and ports and rail connections not as profit centers, but as strategic assets. Looking forward, the completion and opening of the Gordie Howe Bridge will be watched with intense interest by governments and businesses around the world. Will Canada use its leverage wisely, maintaining cooperative relationships while quietly holding a deterrent? Or will the temptation to press the advantage prove too strong, leading to new tensions? The answers to these questions will shape North American trade relations for decades. What is undeniable is that Canada has fundamentally altered the calculus of continental commerce. The days of unilateral American economic dominance in North America are fading. In their place is emerging a more balanced, more complex relationship where leverage can shift, where strategic thinking by smaller powers can neutralize brute economic force, and where infrastructure is understood not just as roads and bridges, but as tools of statecraft. The $5.7 billion investment in the Gordie Howe Bridge will be remembered not just as an engineering achievement, but as a masterclass in strategic patience and long-term planning. Canadian officials who pushed for full Canadian funding likely understood even years ago that control would someday prove valuable. They could not have predicted the exact scenario that would unfold, but they understood the principle. Whoever controls the choke points controls the game. For Donald Trump, this episode represents a rare but instructive defeat. The man who built his political brand on deal-making prowess and tough negotiating tactics found himself outmaneuvered by a country he had dismissed as weak and dependent. The lesson, if he chooses to learn it, is that bravado and threats are no substitute for understanding the actual balance of power and leverage in any given situation. The broader implications for global trade are profound. We are entering an era where economic warfare is increasingly sophisticated. Tariffs are crude instruments. Infrastructure control is elegant and devastating. The countries that will thrive in this new environment are those that think strategically about their investments, that understand the vulnerabilities in global supply chains, and that position themselves to control critical nodes in networks of commerce. As this chapter closes and the Gordie Howe Bridge prepares to open to traffic, one thing is certain: the balance of power in North American trade has shifted. Canada demonstrated that a well-placed investment, years in the making, could neutralize the economic threats of a much larger neighbor. The bridge stands as a testament to the power of strategic infrastructure and the changing nature of economic leverage in the 21st century. Checkmate indeed.